thank you for coming out. I'd like to especially thank Dr. Hawkins for bringing her students out and some of my students who are here. My name is Jose Lopez Calleja. I'm a professor in the School of Business. I teach economics. And I'm here to introduce Dr. Bradley Schiller, who is our featured speaker today, right? And he will be giving a presentation on the agonizingly slow recovery of the U.S. economy, right? I want to give you a little bit of background and introduce Dr. Schiller. Dr. Bradley Schiller has over 4 decades of experience teaching introductory economics courses at the University of Nevada, American University, the University of California at Berkeley, and the University of Maryland, right? He has given guest lectures to more than 300 colleges and universities, ranging from Fresno, California to Istanbul, Turkey. Dr. Schiller's unique contribution to teaching is his ability to relate basic principles to current socioeconomic problems, institutions, and public policy decisions. This perspective is evident through his well-regarded book, The Economy Today. Dr. Schiller derives this policy focus from his extensive experience as a Washington consultant. He has been a consultant to most federal agencies, many congressional committees, and political candidates. In addition, he has evaluated scores of government programs and helped to design many others. His studies of poverty, discrimination, training programs, tax reform, pension, welfare, Social Security, and lifetime wage patterns have appeared in both professional journals and the popular media. Dr. Schiller is also a frequent commentator on economic policy for TV and radio, and his commentary has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Los Angeles Times, among many other newspapers. Dr. Schiller also has an interest not only in the U.S. economy, but also a newfound interest in the Cuban economy, which he won't talk about today, maybe at some other point, right? He received a PhD from Harvard University and a BA degree with great distinction from the University of California at Berkeley. At this time, I would like to introduce our featured speaker for today, Dr. Bradley Schiller. So.
Before Dr. Schiller comes up,
yes.
My students in my 950 class pay very close attention because I want a one-page summary.
I'm doing the same thing.
Damn, there's going to be a test after this. Well, it's really interesting to be here right now because everyone looks like they're in the middle of winter down here in Miami. I actually live in the Sierras at Lake Tahoe at 6,000 feet. And this is normally our winter season and we're skiing. But as you might have heard, we're having a heat wave out west. So this is a very rare experience where I come to Miami this time of year to cool off rather than to warm up. So we're both having very different kinds of winters. Anyway, what I want to talk about today is the economy, obviously, and the problem getting jobs in this economy. How many of you tried to find a job without success? Anybody been looking for jobs? It's been a very tough market. You know, we had a bad recession, started in 2008. It was such a bad recession, we now refer to it as the Great Recession. But that recession is over. It ended, officially ended 5 years ago. So it's sort of like ancient history. But most Americans don't feel that way about the economy these days. Public opinion polls show that a majority of Americans think we're still in a recession, despite the fact that it officially ended back in April of 2009. When we say the recession ended, what we mean is the economy, instead of contracting, turned around and started to grow again in mid-2009. And since 2009, the economy's continued to grow, but at a very slow pace. And a lot of Americans, particularly those who are still unemployed or looking for work, don't believe that the economy has rebounded from the recession. In fact, another poll shows that more Americans believe that aliens have invaded Earth than believe that the recession has ended. So that's a pretty bad commentary. And so what I want to examine is what is the reason for this disbelief? Why are unemployment rates still high? Why are millions of Americans still out of work 5 years into an economic recovery? So what I want to do is look at the nature of the Great Recession, the magnitude of the Great Recession, and assess where we are in the job market today, and finally ask, well, why aren't we doing better? Why isn't the economy generating more jobs? Why don't more Americans believe that we're in an economic recovery? So just a real quick review of what started the Great Recession. I think you've all heard all about this in previous economics classes. You go back to the early 2000s, Americans were feeling really good about their wealth and their economic situations, largely because housing prices were rising every single year. Americans were getting wealthy simply based on the increasing value of their homes. And that sort of stopped in around 2006. The housing prices didn't fall right away, but you can see for a couple of years here, they sort of stabilized at a peak. And most people at the time thought, well, that's just a little pause in the ever-rising value of homes. But that wasn't to be the case. Home prices then plummeted, as you can see, in 2007 and 2008. And that stripped away, billions of wealth from American households, and they trimmed the sails, and we fell into the Great Recession. One of the amazing things about the recession is that even though consumers were losing a lot of wealth in the falling value of their homes, they continued to spend. What this shows is the percentage increase in spending. And you can see it was trending down, but people were still spending more every year than they had the previous year up until the recession really got deep. There's only a brief period here where spending turns negative, which means people are spending less than they were in the previous period. One of the hallmarks of the American economy is the American consumer, who will always spend more money. If you look at the record, Americans do a wonderful job of going to the malls and going on the internet and spending money. And that's about 70% of all spending in the U.S. economy comes from the consumer. Well, let's see here. Investment's a whole different story. Investment is only about 15, sometimes 16% of total spending in the economy. So it's a small part of the total picture. But it is the tail that wags the dog. You can see what happened here in the Great Recession. Investment spending plummeted first in 2007, and then again. This is not the scale, because if it was the scale, it would go all the way down to the floor. It was the biggest one-quarter drop in investment spending since the Great Depression. Investment spending, which is on capital equipment and software and buildings and machinery, fell by 50%, 50% in one quarter. And that, more than anything else, is what plummeted the economy into the Great Depression. Government spending, as you know, hardly ever goes down, even though governments are always saying they don't have enough money, they have to cut here and there. They rarely cut. There was only one brief negative quarter in government spending where government actually spent less, and that was really an artifact of the defense budget just for institutional reasons. And so if you look at the whole economy, when we talk about the economy, we're talking about gross domestic product, all of the goods and services we produce. And we can see here quite clearly is what dragged the economy down in 2008, 2009 was the decline in investment spending. And so, again, although it's a small component of total output, it is highly unstable. In fact, here's an interesting way of looking at it. What this does is ask from one quarter to the next, what happens to spending, the different components of spending. Here, I'm in Nevada right now where we bet on everything. All right? Unfortunately, unfortunately, on the 49ers in the Super Bowl, but that's another story. I don't want to go into. Anyway, here's a simple question. If you had to bet whether consumer spending will increase from this quarter to the next quarter, would you take the bet? Huh? Forget economic theory, just look at the facts. And the reality is, if you take the 20 quarters from 2000 through 2009, which includes the Great Recession, consumer spending increased quarter to quarter 17 times and went down only 3. So that's a really good bet, right? I mean, the odds overwhelmingly favor that consumer spending will increase next quarter. You don't have to be an economist, you don't have to have a PhD in economics to say consumer spending is probably going to increase next quarter, because it almost always does. Even through the Great Recession, it only decreased 3 quarters. The biggest drop, 3.8%. The biggest rise, 4.3%. So the bottom line is you can depend on consumers to continue spending quarter to quarter. It's not a lot of variation. Very different for investment. If you had to bet whether investment will increase next quarter or not, you look at these numbers and say, well, it's sort of a crapshoot. Right? Through this period, investment increased 9 quarters, went down 11 quarters, and so it's sort of like a 50-50 proposition. And worse yet, look at the variance in it. The biggest drop we saw on the other chart was 50% from one calendar quarter to the next. The biggest increase, almost 40%. So investment spending is all over the map, up and down, up and down. That's why I say it's the tail that wags the dog. When investment spending goes down on construction or machinery or software, when it goes down, companies who produce those goods cut back, they lay off their workers, and we get into sort of that multiplier cycle that you hear about in your macro courses, and the economy trends down. Government spending, will the government spend more or less next quarter? Well, take that bet, because most of the time government spending increases quarter to quarter. Exports are pretty much the same thing. They keep going up quarter after quarter, even in periods that we refer to as the Great Recessions, right? And so what you see is investment spending is a highly volatile element of total output. And that's what turned the economy into the downturn called the Great Recession. And so as investment spending went down, the construction industry plummeted, machinery plummeted, airplanes, all the big capital goods industries went down the tubes. And through the multiplier process, how many of you had macros so far? Well, and so this reverberates through the economy and lays people off. And so what is the bottom line for the American worker? Well, in 2008, we lost 3.6 million jobs. In 2009, we lost even more jobs. So there's a loss of 8 million jobs over this 2-year period called the Great Recession. As I say, the recession ended in mid-2009, and the economy started to grow again. And when the economy is growing, that means new jobs are being created. So we go from really, really bad news, which was the worst bad news since 1981, 1982, and we get into the good news story. And so as the economy slowly turned around, it's like one of these cruise ships, you know, out there in the harbor. They turn very slowly, and they don't accelerate very fast. And so in 2010, we start to have positive job growth in the United States. 1.2 million jobs. The next year, 1.6 million, 2.4, and then last year, 1.4 million jobs created. So we're creating a lot of jobs again in the American economy. That makes the administration happy. That makes economists happy. But we got to ask, you know, why is unemployment still so high? You know, when we measure the unemployment rate, it's people who are out of work and actively seeking a job. Now, there's pretty much agreement that full employment in the United States doesn't mean that everybody has a job or wants one. Full employment doesn't mean zero unemployment. What full employment means is somewhere around 5% unemployment. So we accept the fact that due to a lot of different reasons, structural reasons and frictional reasons, at any moment in time, about 5% of the people who are in the labor market are going to be unemployed, without jobs, and actively seeking a job. We say that's our threshold for what we call full employment, 5% unemployment. And so the question arises, as we create all these jobs over the last 4 years, are we back to what we call full employment? Well, the answer is no. The latest numbers which just came out a couple of weeks ago from the Department of Labor, this is where we are in the States today. Population of 317 million. Out of that 317 million, about half are in the labor force. That means they are either employed or they are not working and actively seeking a job. All right? So how many are in that situation? What we call unemployed. Right? How many of you are working right now? Right? How many aren't working? Of those who aren't working, how many of you are actively seeking a job? Right? So some of you who aren't working now, we don't call unemployed because you're not actively seeking a job. We've only got 3 or 4 people here who are both not working and actively seeking a job. Those are the people that we officially call unemployed. Right? And so you take the whole country, and we're a huge country, 6.7% of the labor force is 6.7% of this number here is not working and actively seeking a job. And we call them unemployed. Well, how many people is that? 10.4 million. But remember, we don't expect to ever reach 0% unemployment. We don't want it for a lot of different reasons we don't have to go into right now. But our standard of success, full employment, is 5%. Well, we're above that threshold right now. If we were at 5% unemployment, there would only be 7.7 million people unemployed in the country. At the moment, there's 10.4. So we have what I call excess unemployment of 2.6 million jobs. There's 2.6 million people unemployed above what we accept as our standard for success. And so we're still short of full employment. Now, in addition, if you follow the news stories about the labor market, you realize that more and more people who are out of work and actively seeking a job and not finding a job are simply giving up. They said, it's not worth my time to go out and look for a job today because I've looked for a job for the last 37 days and no one's answering my emails. I can't get an interview. There's no jobs out there. And if you do this repeatedly, you finally say, screw it, I'm not going to look for a job today. You give up. And we call those workers discouraged. Rightly so. Yeah.
How do they measure that number?
Well, they actually do the interviews. The Census Bureau interviews 60,000 households a month, and they ask those questions. Are you working? Huh? Okay, so that's the end of your labor market. You're employed, right? So we say you're in the labor force and you're employed. Are you working? I already know. Yeah, you raised your hand twice, right? Did you actively seek a job in the last 4 weeks? He says yes. So I know he's not employed, but he's actively seeking a job, so we say he's unemployed.
So that happens on a monthly basis.
On a monthly basis. And then the first Friday of every month, the Labor Department publishes these numbers. So the first Friday in January, they publish the numbers for December of last year. Right? So that's how we measure it. Statistically, for those of you taking statistics, it's amazing to me still after all these years that you can interview 60,000 people and have reliable numbers for 155 million people, but that's another story altogether. All right, it's random sampling. Anyway, so we still have too many people unemployed, and in addition to people like him who are actively seeking a job, you've got 2.4 million people who are on the sidelines. They're not actively seeking a job, but they want a job. They just don't think it's worth their time to go out and search for it. So, they go to the door. You don't go to the beach now because it's too cold, but, you do something else with your day. You're not going to actively seek a job. And so there's 2.4 million people on the sidelines waiting for the labor market to improve. They're waiting to hear that some of their friends who are actively seeking a job find one. You find a job, you tell your friends, company A is hiring. Maybe some of your friends who aren't looking for a job say, hey, maybe I ought to go look for a job myself. I'm going to go over there and see if I can find a job. And so you have 2.4 million people on the sidelines. Now, in addition, our problem, our unemployment problem, or our employment prospects grow over time. Right? The 317 million Americans that exist today, that number keeps growing, right? And we keep having babies, and we have, just demographic growth of the population. And we have immigrations, which you certainly know about in Florida. People coming in, we know in California and the West too, immigration's legal and illegal coming in all the time. And so what does that mean? It means our population goes up by about 1.1% a year, or in real numbers, 1.7 million more Americans every year, legal or illegal. Which means we got to find more jobs. We got to find jobs for our growing population and our growing labor force. And so when we think about these things in dynamic terms, the challenge of reaching full employment gets even more difficult. So let's look at the prospects for getting back to full employment. And let me remind you, before the Great Recession, we were at full employment. Back in 2006, the unemployment rate in this country actually got down to 4.6%. We overachieved our goal back then. And since then, we went all the way up to 10% unemployment in 2009. And we're gradually coming back. These are the best numbers, actually. The White House was so excited that the unemployment rate now is down to 6.7% from a high of 10% back in 2009. They're very excited and they're crowing about all their achievements. But 6.7% unemployment is still a long ways from 5% unemployment, which is our threshold again of success. That's where we were in 2006 and early 2007. So here's the question. What's it going to take to get back to full employment? As we said, the Census Bureau goes out and surveys American households every single month. So here's a very simple question. How many jobs do we have to create every month in order to get back to full employment? No. Huh?
150,000.
Huh?
10,000.
10,000?
100,000 jobs a month.
Well, if I had a magic wand, and President Obama certainly wishes he had one, if you wanted to create full employment tomorrow, how many jobs would you have to create? Where's the numbers? How many jobs, if you could do it instantly, how many jobs would you have to create tomorrow to bring the American economy to full employment tomorrow? Huh? No.
300,000.
No. 2.6 million. That's the difference between where we are now and full employment of 5%. We'd have to create 2.6 million jobs. So if you had a magic wand, and there are econ professors who think they have magic wands, but they never use it, that's what you would have to do. All right, we don't have a magic wand, so my question is slightly different. How many jobs do we have to create a month to reach full employment in a certain period of time? If we don't have a magic wand that we can instantly create full employment, say we want to create full employment by, say, November of 2014, which is a very pivotal month because that's, your elections. And of course the White House would not have full employment. So how many jobs do you have to create a month to reach full employment, say, a year from today? Right, you can do this math. Right? And so you can look at it in those terms. In a static view, you need to create 2.6 million jobs. If you want to create them today, wave your magic wand, boom. What if you want to create them 1 year from today? You want full unemployment before next year's congressional elections. 10,000 jobs doesn't do it. You need 200, it's simple math. I'm simply dividing 2.6 million by 12 months. It means I've got to create 217,000 jobs a month to reach full employment by next year's congressional elections. Let's say we want to go a couple more years until the presidential election, 3 years from now. Will we be at full employment? Will the Democrats be able to say, oh, we achieved full employment? How many jobs do we have to create every month for the next 36 months? 72,000 jobs a month. And so what this does is relate the monthly job creation to our expectations for full employment. If we're creating 217,000 jobs a month, we can say, oh, okay, we'll be at full employment in a year. That's pretty good. If we're only creating 64,000 jobs per month, which is exactly how many jobs were created in December, it would take 4 years to get back to full employment. This is a static view. What this says is that we'll take the number of people who are unemployed today, 2.6 million, and do simple arithmetic, divide that by so many months, and see when we could reach full employment. It's a grossly optimistic view of our future. Why? Well, go back to the dynamics of the population. The population is growing, the labor force is growing, you got 1.5 million immigrants coming into the country. What about jobs for them? To take a dynamic view. The dynamic view recognizes that the population is growing, we need jobs for people entering the labor market. Immigrants are coming in, we need jobs for them. Right? And so 2.6 million is how many jobs we need today. But over the next year, the population is going to increase by close to 2 million people. And you've got all these remember the 2.4 million people who are sitting on the sidelines of the labor market waiting for things to improve before they actively seek a job again. Well, if we in fact create more jobs, those people are going to come back into the labor market as well. So if we think of getting back to full employment in a year, it's not 2.6 million jobs that we need, it's 4.6 million jobs. Well, if that's the case, how many jobs do we have to create each month to get back to full employment? It's a much bigger challenge. 383,000. Over the last 5 years, there's only been 1 month where we came close to that number. In December, remember, we only created 64,000 jobs. Look at that. According to those numbers, if we create only 64,000 jobs a month, how soon will we reach full employment? Huh?
10 years later.
No, you're way too optimistic. If we create only 64,000 jobs a month, how long before we reach full employment? Huh? And it's not going to happen. Never. Do the math. Right? If the labor force is growing by 2 million a year, and you're only creating 64,000 jobs a month, you never reach full employment. Right? If we create 220,000 jobs a month, we can get to full employment in 5 years. We only created 64,000 jobs in December. And so this is why I call it an agonizingly slow recovery. The economy is expanding. It's expanding by 1 or 2%. We had 1 quarter recently, 3%. The economy is growing so slowly that it's not generating enough new jobs. Yes, it's generating new jobs. Every month, as the White House is quick to tell us, every month for the last almost 5 years, we've had net job growth in the United States. What I'm doing here is trying to put those numbers in perspective. Hey, sure, we're creating more jobs, but our economic problem, our unemployment problem is larger than that, and we have a dynamic economy with growing population and growing immigration and growing labor force. we're not keeping up with those numbers. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Just kind of out of curiosity, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about a month ago, and they were talking about the labor numbers or the jobs created. And a lot of the jobs that were lost were service sector production jobs that were high-paying jobs. So are these jobs created between 2010 and 2013, how many of those are part-time jobs versus full-time?
Oh, yeah, well, that's another problem. A lot of these new jobs are part-time jobs, right? When we measure, officially measure unemployment, we don't ask how many hours you're working, we just say, are you employed or not? And so the situation gets even worse.
But it really matters.
It really matters, right? You have a lot of people who are working short hours who want longer hours. Being employed is not a measure of success. You might be employed but working 10 hours, 15 hours a week and you want to work full time. Or you might be working 30 hours a week at $8 an hour when you were making $12 an hour before the recession. So a lot of people who are employed are still in labor market distress. I mean, if we get into that dimension, things look even worse. I'm asking a much simpler question. When does the economy have enough jobs of any kind, part-time, low-wage, whatever, for all the people who want jobs? And clearly, we're not only significantly below that threshold of success, but the prospects for reaching full employment are dim at the rate we are creating jobs in this country right now. Now, this isn't always the case. In fact, this recovery is so anemic compared to earlier recovery. The U.S. has had 13 recessions since World War II. Recessions, when the economy contracts and jobs are lost, is a very common phenomenon, not only in the U.S. economy, but economies across the world. There's the ups and downs of the economic cycle we call the business cycle. Some years are good, the economy is growing well, other years are bad, we go into a little recession. We've had recessions repeatedly, I say 13 since World War II. We had one 1981, 80, 81, 80, 81, 82, 90, 91, 2000, 2001. A lot of little periodic recessions. It's a normal part of economic existence. But what differentiates this economic episode from earlier ones is we always bounce back vigorously from economic downturns. The economy normally comes roaring back after a recession, not creeping slowly back like it has over the last 5 years. Here's a picture of recessions. All right. These are the recovery period. So you take a recession, let's say the 1930s. Everybody talks about the Great Depression of the 1930s. And people think of that as a 10-year period of economic decline in the United States. That's not true at all. I mean, I don't know how these things get so, these images get so popular. The Great Depression was not a period of 10 years of decline. There was actually an economic recovery in the mid-1930s. It just didn't last long enough. So the first part of the so-called Great Depression was when the economy declined from 1930 to 1933. But then there was a very, very robust recovery for 3 more years in 1934, 35, and 36, where the economy, total output, GDP, grew by 10.9% in the first year of recovery, 8.9% in the second year of recovery, and 13.1% in the third year of recovery. Jobs were being created. Everybody was thinking the recession is over. Then we got slammed and went back into another one, but that's another story. People refer to the Reagan recovery. Here's your Reagan recovery. 1981, 1982 was the recession. And then we came out of the recession at 4.5% growth, 7.2% growth, and 4.1. Pretty good recovery, and we created millions and millions of jobs. Now look at the most recent recovery. The recession is 2008, 2009. So what are the recovery years, the 3 years after, 2010, 2011, and 2012? Look at these numbers. The best year of the Obama recovery, what was the best year? 2.4% growth, right? 2.4% growth. The best year of the Obama recovery is worse than the worst year of any other recovery. The best Obama recovery year is a lower growth rate than any other recovery. So while the White House says, yes, the economy is getting better and we're creating more jobs and the unemployment rate is coming down, you have to put that in a historical perspective and say, oh, how come we're not creating more jobs? How come the economy is not growing faster, rebounding faster, as it has in every other economic episode? Every other episode. Yeah.
Does outsourcing has an influence at what point in the graphic? At what year do you think that outsourcing of jobs and the total dismantlation of the fabrics and the factories?
Manufacturing.
At what year more or less do we see that impact?
First of all, you've had outsourcing throughout all these periods.
Okay.
Secondly, manufacturing is a very small part of the economy. Thirdly, when we talk about outsourcing, like our jobs are going to China, right? China has shed more manufacturing jobs than we ever had. Manufacturing is shrinking everywhere in the world. Not because jobs are leaving America and going to China, but because manufacturing is becoming so efficient. And take the auto industry, for example. You go back to 1981, we had 600,000 auto workers producing 15 million cars. Today we have 200,000 auto workers producing 17 million cars. So we have 400,000 jobs fewer in the auto industry, not because we're producing cars in China, it's just we've become so productive. Boeing, it used to take 40 days to produce an airplane. Now they do it in 28 days. Right? I mean, we've become extraordinarily efficient, and productivity increases every single year. Every business in America, every business in the world is always trying to figure out, how can we produce this more efficiently? How can we produce it at less cost? And over time, we've become extraordinarily efficient, and that's a continuing trend. I mean, no one really believes that we're doing as good as we can possibly do. You know, information technologies and improving, you know, our general knowledge, our knowledge of the workplace, our managerial expertise improves every year. That's why you're in school. To become better workers, better people, you know, more efficient in your life and in your work. Well, that's a continuing process all over the world. Productivity is always increasing. A bad year is when productivity increases only by a couple of percent. A good year is when productivity increases by 5 or 6%, which means you can produce things with fewer resources than you could before. So, going back here. So, the reality is that we've had anemic growth of the economy. Yes, it's improving. Let's look at the labor market implications of that. Oh, this is just a little picture of economic recoveries of the past. Here's the recovery from 2000, from the Great Recession. You can see the growth path of the economy in earlier recessions. Let's do that in job terms, okay? This is our current situation. In the post-recovery years, we saw the numbers of a minute ago, 1 million jobs or 1.8 million jobs per year being created in the recovery period. How does that compare, say, to the Reagan recovery? 3.4 million jobs in the first year, 3.9 million jobs in the second year. You can see, you know, order of magnitude here that 2 to 3 times more jobs were being created in the recovery from the early 1980s than the recovery now. And Bush, everybody, you know, derides Bush's economy, but even under Bush, jobs were created at a much higher rate than they are in the current administration. You know, 2 million jobs versus 1 million jobs, 2.5 versus 1.8. That adds up. And it's even more remarkable if you compare, say, the Reagan recovery to the Obama recovery. Back then, you know, this is 30 years ago, the Reagan recovery. The population was smaller, the labor force was smaller, and so creating 3.4 million jobs from a much smaller base is hugely more significant in creating 1 million jobs from a much larger base. So if you put the Reagan achievements into today's proportions, you'd say, whereas in the first year of this recovery we created 1 million jobs, the equivalent number adjusted for the size of the population would be 4.9 million jobs in the Reagan years. Which is to say the job recovery, the job creation, was 4 to 5 times more robust, more successful back in the 80s recovery than it is today. And the same numbers would apply to the Bush thing. So when you look at these jobs numbers in an historical context, you got to say this has been literally the worst economic recovery in American history. The worst economic recovery in American history. Yes?
What are some of the external factors that would contribute to that? And what is the actual, that thing, that elusive thing? If somebody had it, they would want to create more jobs, right? So no president is sitting in his office going, how do I create less jobs? So what are the external forces during the Reagan or Bush eras after those recessions, you would say, stimulated the economy more than it did in the last two Obama administrations?
Okay. Well,
Because you have to contribute some external factors to something. The numbers don't just.
yeah, they don't come out of random. Absolutely right. So you're asking the $64,000 question. Why is this the worst economic recovery in history? Why is the Obama recovery so much worse than the Reagan recovery or even the Bush recovery? Right? And it goes back to the basic macro policies of the administration, the macroeconomic philosophy of the administration. And the president was quite explicit about this. President Obama believed from day one that the government spending an increase in government spending could lead us out of the recession. Remember, what creates jobs? More spending. You got to have more spending in the economy. And we looked at the elements of spending: consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and export spending. Okay? The president firmly believed, and was quite explicit, that the government would lead us out of the recession. Increasing government spending would lead us out of the recession. And he even went so far as to say, I don't know if you remember this, that we have millions of shovel-ready jobs out there in America. All we need to do is fund them. Right? Well, the president was completely oblivious to reality when he made that statement. Okay? He said there's a shovel-ready job. So if you, okay, take an example. Let's say you give $10 million to the Department of Transportation to improve Highway 95. Expand it, please expand it, because that traffic is unbelievably bad. Anyway, you give $10 million to the Department of Transportation to widen Highway 95 between here and North Fork, okay? And Congress actually acts immediately. There's no bickering between the Republicans and Democrats. They pass the president's wish list immediately. Today, here's my question. When do they start building the road? When do they start building the road? Yeah.
Brett,
Yeah.
just to disagree with you a little bit.
Oh, I don't know what I said.
It has to be another economist, Brett, to do that. But I think there's part of the picture here that we also need to tell. For example, what happened during the Reagan recovery, what happened during the Bush recovery, both Bush 1 and Bush 2. There were massive increases in government spending. In fact, if you look at the national debt, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the national debt when Ronald Reagan took office was about $1 trillion, actually a little bit less. But by the time he left the presidency in 1988, it had mushroomed to almost $2.8 trillion, so it tripled. So, and the same thing, George Herbert Walker, Bush III, brother, inherited that and had to continue that massive spending. So didn't a lot of that massive government spending that occurred during the 1980s and the early 1990s, which contributed significantly to the debt that we have today, and of course has continued, except for a short period that help to create jobs and, we're not looking at that portion.
Okay, I will look at it with you. Okay, remember, what is our goal here? If we want the economy to recover and create more jobs, we've got to increase spending. And you have a choice. You can pull some levers to increase consumer spending, pull some levers to increase investment spending, pull some policy levers to increase exports. There's, different levers to move each of these spending components. What I'm saying is that at the outset, the president made clear what his preference was to increase government spending, not on defense like Reagan, but on domestic projects. These millions of shovel-ready jobs. So let me come back to my question, and then I'll turn around the full circle here. If you give $10 million to the Department of Transportation to widen Highway 95 today, my question is, when does the construction start? When are the jobs created? No. I'm saying we'll fund it today. Congress approves the money today. When does construction actually start?
Doesn't that money go to the states?
Well, yeah. Years from today is the right answer. Okay, I will tell you why. Okay, by law, the government must solicit bids for the construction jobs. You can't just give it to the governor's nephew, right? By law, the federal government must publish in the Daily Federal Register their intent to spend $10 million improving and widening Highway 95 in Florida. They solicit bids. The bidding time span is 6 months. You have 6 months for contractors in Florida or anywhere else in the world to offer a contract to the federal government to widen Highway 95. There's 6 months. Then the bureaucrats in the Department of Transportation have to review those bids. That process takes 4 to 6 months. You're keeping up here? We're already at 10 months, almost a year. After they select a winner, a winning bid to widen Highway 95, they announce it in the Federal Register. Anyone who has come in second or third place says, wait a minute, you didn't understand my bid, I protest. And protests occur 90% of the time on any lucrative contract because there's no downside to it. It costs you a little legal time, but you might overturn the decision, you might get a piece of the action, and so there's always a protest. Well, that triggers a re-review of those contracts. It will take about 18 months, everything goes swimmingly well, to award a final contract to the contractor to begin construction on Highway 95. But the shovels don't hit the ground yet. Because the last step in the process is an environmental impact study, which is required by law. No federal shovel can hit the ground without an environmental impact study. So the Department of Transportation does its own environmental impact study. Another 4 or 5 months. They publish a study that says, oh, the environmental impact will be minimal, right? Anybody can sue the federal government and say, that was an inadequate assessment of the environmental impact. And they do, all the time. All the time. So if we actually gave them, Congress gave the money to the Department of Transportation today to widen 95, I guarantee you, you won't see a shovel hit the ground for 3 years. 3 years. President Obama, in an interview with the New York Times in November of 2010, said, I had way too much faith in shovel-ready. I now know there is no such thing. Okay? So if you're counting, and this goes back to your question, if you're counting on an increase in spending on construction and highways and infrastructure, which he explicitly did, because he thought it would happen quickly, he was completely wrong and has since admitted. Secondly, no economic recovery has occurred because of an increase in government spending. Go back and remember that I showed you the volatility of different components of spending. What's the most volatile element of spending? Business investment. So what did Reagan and Bush do differently than Obama? They said, okay, we got to pull one of these levers. They're philosophically opposed to bigger government. Philosophically, wanted to emphasize the private sector. So they pulled levers to increase investment spending rather than government spending. And if you tell the corporation that they're going to get an incentive to spend more, they're much more quicker to respond than the Department of Transportation. So you have a very different policy approach. It's a policy approach that even the president himself has admitted in retrospect was over-optimistic. The president has still not put any emphasis on investment spending. President Reagan cut taxes massively to motivate consumer spending and investment spending, and President Bush did the same thing. Capital gains cuts, investment incentives, and President Obama has not. So two things are irrefutable. This is the worst economic recovery in American history. We're not going to reach full employment anytime soon. Third, if you're looking for causation, there's a very different policy approach to this recovery than prior recoveries, and we're paying the price. All right, we're going to run out of time. Any last questions?
Q&A? Questions or is there a question?
Yeah.
So the impact, basically taxation, over-regulation can hinder the growth of jobs.
Pretty much, remember, there's only really three big policy approaches. Fiscal policy, which is the use of government spending and taxes, manipulation of spending and taxes. Monetary policy, which is the money supply and interest rates, and supply side policy. We've had massive infusion of fiscal stimulus, massive infusion of monetary stimulus. So you have to ask, well, what's wrong? And the answer then goes to the supply side, which is regulation of the economy.
So given your knowledge, if you were president, what would you do?
I'd warm up Florida, first of all. No, I would clarify and trim the regulation of American business. If you talk to banks and you talk to businesses, the first thing they talk about is the regulation. Banks are sitting on $1.5 trillion of reserves they're not lending out. Banks make profits by lending money. Why aren't they doing it? Because they don't even know what the banking regulations are.
More bipartisan support probably help to.
Well, before I moved to Washington, and let me say, I have advised both Democrat and Republican administrations. And people always complain about it. There's so much bickering, nothing's getting done in Washington. What I learned, and I taught at the School of Public Affairs, all my colleagues were political scientists. I said, Brad, why would you think that's such a bad thing that Congress doesn't act? Right? Yeah. Not passing new laws and legislation isn't always a bad thing.
The jobs bill.
Huh?
The jobs bill.
But these jobs bills are minuscule. When you put it up, another $10 billion is a big number, but in the context of our economy, a $16 trillion economy, where we need, 250,000 jobs a month, it doesn't really do much.
And when they, like during the 80s and the early 90s, that's when they invented the computers and the internet so that people can buy stuff online, stuff like that. Didn't help any of the recovery.
Well, it just made it easier for people to buy things. But remember, even before the internet, Americans did a very good job of spending every dime they got and more. People get a raise of $100 to go out and buy $150 worth of stuff and hoping that they can pay off the credit card bill. We're real good at that. In fact, the classic case, going back to the economic recovery, the Bush economic recovery, the centerpiece of that one was a tax rebate. And so everybody in America got, what was it, $300 or $600 depending on their...
It was about $268.
Well,
The median was about $268.
okay, but remember there's 110 million households, and you do the math, that's a lot of money. It was $100 billion all total, right? And the unique part of that particular rebate was you could go online, and based on your social security number, you would know which week you were going to get the check or the automatic deposit to your bank account. Okay? And so what happened is, you find out, oh, I'm going to get the check in 2 weeks. People would go to the mall and spend the money and figure, oh, when the credit card comes at the end of the month, I'll have the money. People went out in anticipation of the tax cut and spent money. And if you go back and look at the first quarter of what was that, 2003, you go back and look, you see the spike in consumption that occurs right before the tax cuts actually hit the mail. And of course, that's, Americans do a wonderful job spending money. And that's a really unique characteristic of the American economy, that 70+% of the economy is based on consumer spending, and we're always spending money. Yeah, we do it. All right, well, thanks a lot for coming. Come out to California if you want to warm up.